The sound of a police siren pierces the still air. David Coleman, dressed in a sharp suit, pulls over to the side of the road. A quiet moment of uncertainty. He's calm, collected, but the officer's suspicion is palpable. As Officer Mike Reynolds approaches, his eyes narrow. The officer sees only a black man in a suit, a threat in his mind. But he has no idea who he's really dealing with. David remains composed, every word measured, but as the officer's questions escalate, the truth slowly emerges. What happens when the man you least expect to have power turns out to be the one with the most? The late sun hung low over the quiet San Diego suburbs, casting long golden streaks across the asphalt. The kind of California evening that looked peaceful on the surface. David Coleman, 58, was heading home from a long day at the department. The AC hummed softly in his luxury sedan, jazz playing low on the radio. His tailored navy suit still held its crease, and the day's weight hadn't yet touched his expression. He looked like a man at ease. But in America, for a black man, peace is often temporary. Just as he slowed near a four-way stop, flashing red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror. "Seriously?" he murmured, eyebrows tightening. He pulled over, lowered the window, and took a slow breath. A white patrol officer stepped out of the cruiser, boots clicking on the pavement. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, with mirrored sunglasses that didn't bother coming off. "License and registration," the officer said flatly. David handed them over without a word, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "Was there a reason for the stop, officer? You rolled that stop sign back there. In a bit of a hurry, are we?" I paused. "But I understand," David replied, voice measured. "Anything else?" The officer looked him up and down. "You live around here?" "I do. Just a few miles west, over on Rosemont." "You sure about that?" David blinked. "It's on my license." A pause. Tension. The air turned heavier, sharper. Not from the words, but from the way they were said. Something unspoken pressed against the conversation. David's grip on the wheel loosened, his smile faint but practiced. He'd been here before, not at this stop sign, but at this moment, where identity wasn't just questioned. It was challenged. And this time, someone chose the wrong man. Officer Mike Reynolds stood with his thumbs hooked casually in his belt, his mirrored lenses hiding the calculation in his eyes. He looked like the kind of cop who believed the badge was an extension of his authority, not a reminder of responsibility. 34 years old, sharp jawline, short fade, and a bulletproof attitude. He wasn't the kind of man who liked to be questioned, especially not by someone who looked like David Coleman. David, still seated, watched the officer with a kind of stillness that only comes from living through moments like this before. He wasn't new to the game. He'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't granted. It had to be maintained, especially in the face of disrespect. And right now, disrespect was approaching like a freight train with a badge. "You from Rosemont?" Reynolds asked, circling the car like a hawk. "Yes," David answered evenly, keeping both hands visible on the wheel. "I've lived there just over a year now." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "Nice part of town. Lot of lawyers and executives over there." David said nothing. He wasn't going to bite. "You don't look like someone who lives in Rosemont," the officer added. David turned his head slowly. "And what exactly does someone from Rosemont look like?" Reynolds didn't answer. He just smirked and shifted his stance. The silence thickened, charged. David could feel it building. The invisible line between justified authority and personal bias was about to be crossed. "You step out of the car for me?" Reynolds asked, too politely to be polite. David glanced at him, then out to the quiet street. "Is there a legal reason, officer?" "Routine check. Standard procedure," Reynolds replied, his hand resting just a little too close to his holster. David paused, then unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out with the slow, deliberate calm of a man who understood the stakes. Now they stood face to face. David, at 6 feet 2 inches, was slightly taller, broader, but everything about his demeanor was disarming. His charcoal gray suit still held its crease. His watch, polished shoes, and calm posture told a different story than Reynolds wanted to see. But the young officer wasn't reading the details. He was stuck on the surface. "Turn around. Hands on the hood," Reynolds instructed, voice clipped. David's jaw tightened, but he complied. As Reynolds moved in, patting him down with brisk, impersonal swipes, David stared straight ahead, through the windshield, through the moment, his mind ticking not with fear, but calculation. Reynolds wasn't the problem. He was a symptom of something older, deeper, something David had faced in the form of whispers, smirks, dismissals, And now, a routine stop turned something else. "You're clean," Reynolds muttered. David turned his head slowly, voice low. "Of course I am." And still, Reynolds didn't step back. This wasn't about traffic. It never was. The sky above was softening into dusk, but the air between the two men had grown sharp, almost metallic. The kind of tension you could feel in your bones. Officer Mike Reynolds wasn't backing down, and David Coleman wasn't stepping out of line. But he also wasn't backing down either. Reynolds took a slow breath through his nose, pacing a short line in front of the car as if trying to locate something. Anything, to justify what he was feeling. Not what he had seen, but what he felt. David straightened his suit jacket, his tone still calm, but now laced with something firmer. "Officer, I complied with your instructions. You've run your check. If there's nothing further." Reynolds cut him off. "Where were you headed in such a hurry anyway?" "Hurrying?" David raised an eyebrow. "I was driving under the speed limit, and I came to a pause at the sign." "Didn't look like a full stop to me," Reynolds muttered. David exhaled slowly. "That's a matter of discretion. But I'm not here to argue. I'm just trying to get home." "You always this smooth when you get pulled over?" Reynolds asked, squinting at him. "Like you've done this before." "I've had experience," David replied. "Uh-huh." Reynolds stepped in closer, uncomfortably so. "You got something to hide?" David met his gaze without blinking. "No. But it's interesting you'd ask that, after you've searched me and found nothing." A long silence settled between them. One of those silences where pride and prejudice dance in the air, waiting for someone to move first. Then came the next blow. "Turn around and place your hands back on the hood," Reynolds ordered. David's tone cooled. "Again?" "Standard protocol," Reynolds snapped. David didn't move right away. "Or maybe you're hoping for a different result." Reynolds' hand brushed the edge of his belt, not quite at the holster, but close enough to send a message. David read it loud and clear. With a practiced breath, he turned and placed his palms flat on the warm hood of his sedan once more. The steel beneath his hands reminded him of every stop that had ended like this. Some harmless, some humiliating, some worse. Reynolds moved behind him again. This time, the pat-down wasn't just about checking for weapons. It was about control. His hands lingered at the shoulders, pressed too firmly at the waist, swept twice over the same spots. It was about sending a message, "I'm in charge." But David didn't flinch, didn't stiffen. He let the indignity pass through him without giving it weight. That was the battle, not to give it weight. "You're clean," Reynolds said again, but this time with a sour edge, like the words cost him something to say. "I told you I was," David replied without turning his head. Reynolds stepped back a pace, visibly irritated. His fingers tapped against the edge of his belt, his jaw clenched tight. "You seem to know a lot about police procedure. What are you, a lawyer or something?" David turned around slowly, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. "Something like that," he said, offering nothing more. Reynolds didn't like the mystery. He didn't like the way David spoke without fear. He didn't like how composed this man was, even after everything. And deep down, he didn't like that he felt outmatched. Officer Reynolds stood still, as if momentarily unsure of his next move. The usual rhythm of the stop, command, compliance, authority, had begun to slip. David's voice broke the silence, steady but low. "Is this really about a stop sign, officer?" Reynolds' jaw tensed. "Excuse me? You've searched me. You've checked my ID. You've confirmed I live where I say I do. And yet, here we are. Still here." Reynolds crossed his arms. "Just doing my job." David studied him for a long moment. "Your job, officer, or your judgment?" It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a question soaked in experience, too calm to be confrontational, too precise to ignore. The street was quiet except for the occasional distant hum of traffic. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler clicked on. But between these two men, the world had narrowed to a point, like the tip of a needle pressing against skin. David turned slightly and looked past the cruiser. In that brief glance, a memory rose, uninvited but all too familiar. He was 17 again. Birmingham, Alabama. A 10-speed bike and a backpack full of textbooks. He'd been stopped for riding erratically, forced off his bike, hands on the sidewalk, while his classmates watched from across the street. The officer's voice from that day still echoed, as if it had been embedded in his ribs. "Where'd you steal this from, boy?" No apology came after they'd let him go. Just laughter. The kind that follows you home. That lingers when you try to sleep. And that was only the first of many. David blinked the memory away, but the scar was still there, not visible, but deep, layered between years of education, promotions, polished titles, and doors he had to force open just to be heard. He spoke again, gentler now. You know, I've spent my whole life having to be twice as good to get half as far. I've worn this suit. I've earned this life. And still, I get stopped on a quiet street, asked if I belong in my own neighborhood. Reynolds didn't respond. He was shifting internally but not outwardly. His silence was no longer dominance, it was uncertainty. You seem familiar with how this works, Reynolds said finally, almost accusatory. David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Familiar enough to know when the rules shift. Reynolds stepped closer again, as if trying to regain the ground he was slowly losing. You think you're smarter than me? I don't think anything, David replied. I just know who I am. And I know the law. Which means I know what this isn't. The statement hung there, sharp and unmistakable. Reynolds blinked. David's posture hadn't changed, but his presence had. There was a weight to him now. One that came from experience, not intimidation. The kind of weight that men carried when they'd survived what others wouldn't. The officer shifted his feet. You don't look nervous, Reynolds muttered. I've had a lifetime to practice, David said softly. For a flicker of a second, the younger man saw him. Not the driver, not the suspect, not the target. He saw the man. But the moment passed. Reynolds stepped back, unsettled. David remained still. The air hadn't cleared. But the balance had shifted. Officer Reynolds hadn't said a word in nearly 30 seconds, but his fingers twitched along the edge of his duty belt. His face was trying to hold firm, but the composure he wore earlier was cracking around the edges. Something about David Coleman wasn't fitting the usual mold, and Reynolds could feel it. You're awful confident for someone pulled over in a traffic stop, he said, the words sharp but slightly uneven. David didn't flinch. He tilted his head just a touch. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. It's about respect. And from where I stand, there's been a lack of it since the moment you walked up. Reynolds stepped forward again, squinting. What do you do for a living? There it was. The need to put him in a box. David's eyes met his, calm and unwavering. I believe you're about to find out. With slow, deliberate movements, David reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. His voice was clear, his tone unshaken. I'm reaching for my badge. Just my badge. Reynolds' hand immediately twitched toward his holster. For a split second, instinct overtook reason. Easy, David said gently, not out of fear, but warning. No theatrics. No need for all that. Just watch. He withdrew a slim leather case and flipped it open. The gold shield gleamed in the fading sunlight. David Coleman, Director of Internal Affairs, San Diego Police Department. Reynolds froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His gaze flicked from the badge to David's face, as if hoping it was some elaborate joke. But there was no humor in David's expression, only a quiet steadiness, and maybe just a trace of disappointment. Internal Affairs, Reynolds said under his breath, almost choking on the words. Yes, David replied, his voice even but edged with finality. I oversee officer conduct. My role is to ensure the badge you wear stands for something better than what just happened here. The wind stirred slightly. A dog barked in the distance. But between them, the stillness was absolute. Reynolds stepped back half a pace, the shift almost imperceptible, but not to David. I gave you every opportunity to do this right, David said. You chose suspicion over decency. You made assumptions based on skin before facts. Reynolds looked down, his face pale. David took one step forward, not to intimidate, but to remind. And you did all of that, he said quietly, to the man who now decides if you're still fit to wear that badge. For a long, heavy second, Officer Reynolds said nothing. Then finally, he exhaled, the weight of the moment hitting all at once. David didn't gloat. He didn't have to. The truth had done all the talking. Officer Mike Reynolds stood frozen, the wind knocked from his composure. The badge David Coleman had shown him was real, and heavy with meaning. For the first time in the entire encounter, Reynolds looked like he didn't know what to do next. David didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What's your badge number, Officer Reynolds? David asked, calm as ever. Reynolds shifted on his feet. Why? Because I make it my business to know the names of men who let their instincts run ahead of their duty. There was no anger in David's voice, just quiet, measured authority. And that was worse. Fury could be dismissed. But stillness? That was judgment. You're not going to file a complaint, are you? Reynolds asked, his tone low, almost pleading. Look, maybe this came off wrong. I didn't mean anything by it. David's eyes narrowed slightly. You didn't have to mean it. That's the problem. Reynolds looked away, jaw clenched. The weight of what had just happened was finally beginning to settle. Not just the embarrassment, but the truth. He hadn't just profiled the wrong man. He had profiled the right man. Someone in a position to expose exactly how broken the system could be when left unchecked. David took one step closer, not threatening but firm. Do you know what troubles me most about this stop? Reynolds said nothing. That you didn't even pause to think you were crossing a line, David continued. You didn't recognize the signs. My tone, my awareness, my language. You weren't listening, because the only thing you saw was my skin. That hit. Reynolds swallowed hard. His shoulders dropped ever so slightly. I didn't see. David stopped him with a raised hand. But you should have. You wear a badge. That means something. Or at least it's supposed to. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Of reckoning. Of the heavy shift when truth refuses to be ignored. And for Officer Reynolds, the balance had finally fully tipped. The next morning, the soft hum of fluorescent lights filled David Coleman's office at the Internal Affairs Division. The city hadn't changed overnight, but something in him had shifted, subtly but undeniably. He sat behind his desk, surrounded by file folders, notes scribbled in the margins, and a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The badge sat quietly on the corner of his desk, not the one in his wallet, but the one etched into his responsibility. On the top of the stack sat a familiar name, Officer Mike Reynolds. David flipped the file open. It didn't surprise him. The contents were what he had feared and expected. A handful of minor complaints, unprofessional conduct, aggressive tone, unnecessary stops. Most of them marked as resolved without follow-up. The pattern was there. Quiet, consistent, and dangerous. A knock on the door broke his focus. "Morning, Mr. Coleman," said Linda, his longtime assistant. She stepped in holding a fresh stack of reports and a warm, knowing smile. "Got the monthly misconduct summaries. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you, department reviews coming up next week." David nodded, rubbing his temple. "Thanks, Linda. Can you do one more thing?" "Of course. Schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels this afternoon. There's something I need to put on the table." Linda paused, sensing something different in his tone. Not anger, but clarity. "Absolutely," she said, then left, closing the door gently behind her. David leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together in thought. This wasn't about Officer Reynolds anymore. Not really. It hadn't been for some time. Reynolds was a symptom, one among many, a reflection of what the department allowed, ignored, or excused when no one was watching. David wasn't interested in small victories. He was ready to pull the curtain back. A broken system doesn't fix itself, he thought. It has to be forced to look in the mirror. And now he had the authority, and the fire, to hold it there. Later that afternoon, the conference room on the third floor of the San Diego Police Headquarters was quiet, too quiet. The blinds were drawn halfway, casting long diagonal lines of shadow across the polished oak table. David Coleman sat at one end, composed but purposeful. Across from him sat Chief Harold Daniels, a man with salt and pepper hair and a face worn by decades of command. Daniels had seen it all, or at least believed he had. But something in David's eyes this time told him, this wasn't just another briefing. David slid the Reynolds file forward without a word. Daniels glanced at the name, his lips thinning. "I've seen that one before." "I know you have," David replied. "And that's the problem." The chief leaned back slowly, fingers laced over his stomach. "You could have written this off as a tough stop. A bad judgment call. That happens." David shook his head. "That's exactly why it keeps happening. Because we excuse it, label it as bad judgment, then close the file." Daniels exhaled hard through his nose. "Look, David, we've handled cases like this internally for years. It keeps things contained." "Contained?" David's voice was soft, but his stare was razor sharp. "Harold, silence doesn't keep the community safe. It keeps us comfortable. And that comfort is costing us trust, bit by bit, every single time an officer like Reynolds gets a pass." The chief looked down for a moment, then met David's eyes. "So what are you proposing?" David didn't hesitate. A department-wide review. Training, accountability systems, protocols, top to bottom. This isn't about Mike Reynolds. It's about the environment that made him believe what he did was acceptable. Daniels leaned forward now, elbows on the table. "You realize this kind of move will rattle the brass. You'll stir every hornet's nest we've spent years keeping still." "Good," David replied. "It's time someone did." The silence that followed wasn't uneasy. It was contemplative. Heavy. Necessary. Daniels gave a small nod. Set it in motion. Let's see who's really ready to wear that badge. And just like that, the conversation shifted from protection to reform. David knew the hard part was only beginning, but he also knew he had just opened the right door. 3 weeks later, the hearing room at Internal Affairs was quiet, but the tension was unmistakable. The long mahogany table gleamed under the overhead lights. A clock ticked softly on the far wall, marking the seconds with unnerving precision. David Coleman sat at the head of the review panel, dressed in the same calm professionalism he carried at that traffic stop. But this time, he wasn't standing on the side of a road. He was sitting in the center of power. Across from him sat Officer Mike Reynolds, noticeably less assured than the man who had strutted up to his car weeks earlier. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes told a different story, restless, uncertain, and tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. The panel began with protocol, a review of Reynolds' personnel file, his field performance, and previous complaints. Nothing in it was explosive, but that was the point. David folded his hands. Officer Reynolds, you've had 6 informal complaints over 5 years. All dismissed. All marked as inconclusive or resolved with verbal counseling. Reynolds cleared his throat. I did what I thought was right in the moment. David leaned in slightly. You didn't do what was right. You did what was easy. You leaned on instinct, on bias, not law. And you crossed the line. I wasn't trying to discriminate, Reynolds said quietly. I just saw something that didn't fit. David paused. That sentence, didn't fit, hung in the air like a slow echo. And that's the conversation we're here to have, David said. Not just about your actions, but the thinking behind them. That's what creates patterns. That's what undermines community trust. Reynolds lowered his gaze. There was no arguing with the evidence. And there was no denying who sat across from him now. Not a civilian, not a suspect, but the man tasked with defending the very integrity of the badge he wore. After deliberation, the panel reached its conclusion. Officer Mike Reynolds would be placed on suspension without pay, pending additional bias training and reassessment. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. David remained quiet as the final decision was read. He watched Reynolds closely, not with anger, but with the weight of someone who understood how deep the rot could go when left unchecked. Later, as the room emptied, David stood. Reynolds paused in the doorway, then looked back. I didn't know who you were that day, he said. David replied without hesitation. You didn't need to know who I was. You only needed to know who you were supposed to be. No further words were exchanged. And in that silence, something settled. Not finished, but set in motion. A month later, the echo of footsteps filled the auditorium of the San Diego Community Center. Folding chairs lined the polished concrete floor, filled with local residents, activists, officers in uniform, and city officials in pressed suits. At the front stood a simple wooden podium, a microphone, and David Coleman. He adjusted the mic slowly, glancing across the sea of faces, some skeptical, some weary, a few quietly hopeful. These were the people who had lived with the consequences of silence. And now they were here to hear if something had finally changed. David cleared his throat and began, not with thunder, but with truth. Justice is more than consequences, he said, his voice even and firm. It's about course correction. It's about creating systems that don't just respond to harm, but prevent it. He didn't mention Mike Reynolds by name. He didn't have to. The room understood what had brought them there. We ask a lot from our communities, he continued. Respect the badge. Trust the uniform. Obey the officer. But that trust must be earned. Maintained. Protected. Heads in the crowd began to nod slowly. The tension softened, not disappeared, but acknowledged. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone, David said, letting the words settle. It makes you accountable to everyone. There was no applause yet. Just silence. The kind that listens. We're reviewing policies. Retraining officers. But more than that, we're rebuilding what was broken. Not with speeches, not with slogans, but with action. Finally, a hand clap. Then another. Then many. David didn't smile. Not yet. Because this wasn't a victory lap. This was a vow. This isn't the end of the conversation, he said. It's the beginning of a better one. And with that, he stepped away from the podium, not as a symbol, but as a man choosing to carry the weight of change. One badge. One voice. Many listening. As David Coleman stepped off the stage and into the crowd, he passed familiar faces. Elders who had marched in the 60s, young officers fresh out of the academy, parents holding their children a little tighter than usual. The applause had faded, but something deeper remained. A quiet sense that something had begun. Later that evening, back in his office, David stood at the window overlooking the city. The badge rested on his desk, just as it had that morning. But tonight, it didn't feel like a symbol of authority. It felt like a promise. This wasn't the first time, he thought, and it won't be the last. But now, the silence had been broken. He turned back toward his desk, where new reports were already waiting. Change didn't come easy. It came layer by layer, case by case, until the culture had no choice but to evolve. Facing the camera, his voice returned, this time for us. If this story speaks to you, don't let it sit in silence. Share it. Talk about it. That's how change begins, not in anger, but in awareness. And with that, he walked out, not to end the story, but to continue writing it. What the story teaches us. What happened between David Coleman and Officer Mike Reynolds wasn't just about a traffic stop. It wasn't even just about race. It was about power, perception, and the quiet choices people make when they think no one is watching. The most valuable lesson from this story is simple but urgent. Real change doesn't start with punishment. It starts with recognition. And recognition begins when we're willing to face uncomfortable truths. Mike Reynolds didn't wake up that morning looking to profile a black man. But he didn't stop himself either. He didn't question his assumptions. He didn't pause when something inside him said, "He doesn't look like he belongs here." And that's the danger, not loud hatred, but quiet, unchecked bias. David didn't fight back with anger. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stood his ground with dignity and let the weight of the truth do the talking. That's a harder road. And for many people of color, it's the road they've had to walk their entire lives. Measured, composed, careful not to give anyone a reason to confirm the very stereotypes they're already judged by. But David did something more. He used his position, his patience, and his power to hold the system accountable. Not just for himself, but for everyone who would come after him. That's what leadership looks like. Not noise, not revenge, but deliberate, principled action. For those of us watching, especially those of us who've lived long enough to see how slowly justice moves, we know how easy it is to become cynical. We've seen too many speeches, too many promises, too many headlines that fade before the ink dries. But this story reminds us, change doesn't come in waves. It comes in drops. And every drop counts. It also reminds us of something many forget in positions of authority. The badge is not a shield from criticism. It's a responsibility to protect with fairness, not force. What makes this story resonate isn't that David was a high-ranking officer. It's that he represented all the people who don't have that badge. All the people who get stopped, questioned, doubted, dismissed, without the power to fight back. He had that power, and he chose to use it wisely. That's the lesson we carry forward. True justice is not about catching bad people. It's about creating a culture where bad behavior can't hide. We all have a role in that, whether we wear a uniform or not. In our conversations, in our communities, in our courage to speak when it would be easier to stay silent. Because silence is where injustice grows. And accountability? That's where healing begins. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone challenged injustice? Not with anger, but with quiet strength and dignity like David did? What would you have done in that situation? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and pass it along to someone who needs to hear it.